All right. Good evening, everybody. Welcome, 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 welcome. I am delighted to kick off this evening's event. My name is Ruthie Gilmore. I'm the director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, and also a professor here at the GC. And we have gathered this evening to celebrate publication of Christina Heatherton's new book, Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. I will introduce our three presenters in a moment, but before I do that, I want to thank everybody who worked to make this evening's event possible, particularly Mary Taylor, who's the Assistant Director of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics, who, working shoulder to shoulder with Michelle Cannon, makes many wonderful things happen here, and we're really grateful as ever, Dr. Taylor. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, including the Mexican Studies Group and our comrades from Reclaim the Commons. And Connor, if you want to say a couple of words, you can say a couple of words. Come up and say those words. No, we have people on the webinar, so use the mic. I unmuted us. Oh no. Okay. I didn't realize it took 2 moves to unmute. All right, webinar people from afar, I'm sorry I didn't turn off the second unmute button. But we're just starting, so Connor.
Hey everyone, just wanted to share some good news. This morning, the Graduate Center Administration made an announcement that after the cafeteria had been closed since the start of the pandemic, and there has been a groundswell of opposition to the administration on a range of issues, but including food access here in the building, that we had initiated a kind of pop-up autonomous pantry inside the dining commons, which is just down here, as an intention to try and open up the cafeteria services and to address a range of other issues in the building around childcare access, the budgeting office being in disarray, people not being paid on time or paid at all, many different issues in the building. We heard this morning that the Grad Center administration is going to be reopening the cafeteria as of this fall. They're going to be establishing a permanent food pantry here in the building. And we really want to claim this as a double victory of people being involved in saying, not just we care about this building, but we want to have a kind of direct role in the decision-making in this building. We want to be able to talk about food insecurity and childcare access and labor exploitation as it relates to the quote unquote life of the mind. So want to be able to name that and celebrate with you all, and hopefully to create more convergent spaces like this one. And just the last piece, this Friday from around 5 p.m. onwards, there's going to be a CUNY-wide convergence in the 8th floor cafeteria, inviting people to come together to envision what a kind of CUNY-wide movement can look like, including actions for May 1st, International Working People's Day, but far beyond that. So if y'all want to come back and contribute to that convergence space, that'll be this Friday, the 31st, 5 p.m. onwards. So thank you again.
Thanks, Connor. And just a shout out to everybody who's worked tirelessly to achieve these victories. Nothing in this building has been easy. All right, now it's my pleasure to introduce our 3 presenters for this evening, and we will get started in our discussion of Arise. And I'm going to do it alphabetically. I don't know how you've arranged yourselves, but I will ask that everybody come up here, maybe for the first part, at least, of the discussion, because the camera is at an odd angle. Robyn C. Spencer-Antoine is a historian who focuses on Black social protest after World War II, urban and working class radicalism, and gender. Her book, The Revolution Has Come, Black Power, Gender, and the Black Panther Party in Oakland was published in 2016. She is co-founder of the Intersectional Black Panther Party History Project and has written widely on gender and Black power. Her writings have appeared in many publications. Her latest work focuses on the intersections between the movement for Black liberation and the movement against the US war in Vietnam. In addition, she's working on biographies of both Angela Davis and Patricia Murphy Robinson. She created @Pat Archives on Instagram to spotlight the ways that the items in Black left theorist Patricia Murphy Robinson's unprocessed home archives reframe the Black radical tradition. So welcome, Professor Spencer-Antoine. Sónia Borges is an interdisciplinary militant historian and social political organizer. Her book, Militant Education, Liberation Struggle Consciousness, the PAIGC Education Program in Guinea-Bissau, 1963 to 1978, was published in 2019. As part of this research, Borges co-authored 2 short films, Navigating the Pilot School, 2016, and Mangrove School, 2022. A prolific writer and translator, she currently teaches at Drexel University in Philadelphia, where she is developing a new project focused on her concept of the walking archive and the processes of memory and imagination. Then, the lead act, Christina Heatherton is the Elting Associate Professor of American Studies and Human Rights at Trinity College. She's the author of Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution, published by the University of California Press in 2022. For 2 decades, she has been working with social movements to produce collaborative works of political and popular education, including Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, published in 2016, co-edited with Jordan T. Camp, and other works. And she currently co-directs the Trinity Social Justice Initiative. And now I want to pause and do a little bragging. All 3 of these amazing comrades are emeritus fellows of the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics. Yes. So Robyn was a faculty fellow on at least 2 occasions. And both Sónia and Christina have been postdoctoral research fellows. And I absolutely have my heart bursting with pride and joy and revolutionary fever and fervor to know that we have gathered together tonight to discuss Christina's book. So the way we'll go is Christina will give us an overview of the book. Then we'll try to figure out how to turn the slides off and make the camera bigger out there in Zoom land. And then Sónia and Robyn will present some comments. We'll have some discussion and open up to the house. All right, so thank you for coming out.
Oh my gosh, I can't believe this is happening. Hi, everybody. Hi. And hi, everybody watching. Thank you so much for coming. This is really amazing to be here. I started writing a list of all the people in the room I wanted to thank, and then I realized it's about everybody. So, you know, this room is full of some of my favorite artists, writers, scholars, organizers, intellectuals. So I really appreciate you all coming. I want to thank above and beyond Mary, Ruthie, and Lucian for making this event possible. And thanks for everybody who's engaged with my work. I also, if you haven't seen it, and I don't know if the camera can you know, show it, but there is the Reclaim the Commons down here is just gorgeous. I'll post a ton of pictures tonight, but this is really beautiful. And this is such an honor to be able to speak in solidarity with it. I want to say that a few weeks ago, I was speaking with graduate students and academic workers at different University of California campuses in the aftermath of their historic strike. And they were really excited to hear that folks at CUNY were circulating their zine, Abolish the UC. And they thought it was important to speak in solidarity with the efforts of Reclaim the Commons and the People's Pantry. So I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you all tonight. And I want to thank you all for your courage in pushing hard conversations about the world we want to live in and the work we want our work to do. I believe that these fights for living wages, for food and sustenance, for housing and dignity, for healthcare and childcare, especially in this pandemic, for cops off campus, for the ability to teach and learn about gender, sexuality, racism, and capitalism, and the world in which we live without punishment, and for the ability to not just survive this moment, but to dream of a life beyond it. I believe that these fights will continue to transform the academy and the world. As Ruthie, Robyn, and Sónia all know, revolutionary movements have at their heart strong collective educational endeavors. So I'm proud to be in the mix with all of you. I hope we can find ways to support one another in this work so that we can sustain ourselves and each other in the long fight ahead. So thank you all for being here tonight. The slides don't work. Let's see. I can do this. All right, well, I've written a book, and this was a book that developed out of a dissertation that I worked with Professor Ruth Wilson Gilmore on. I've known Ruthie for over half my life, and so it's really nice to be able to, finish this. I also want to say, I have so much life here at the GC. I came here as a graduate student a very long time ago, and it was a time where if you wanted to study with geographers, you had to enroll in the anthropology department, right? And so I would tell my family in New York, I'd be like, well, I'm studying radical geography, but I have to get a degree in anthropology in order to do it. And I had an uncle who would always call and say, so which one is it, maps or mummies? So anyway, long story short, I wrote this book in dialogue with Ruthie and a number of other people. I think it's fitting that as an abolitionist text, it thinks very seriously about the making of different things. So each chapter in the book is named after the process of the making of something, an object, a space, how to make a flag, how to make a map, how to make a university. I think for me, this spirit is about being able to say, if we understand how something is made, we can understand how it can be unmade and how things can be made differently. So for my just kind of brief comments today, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about the introduction to the book, which is called How to Make a Rope. So hopefully the slides work, and we'll begin. So, how to make a rope. The ideal rope, explained the Upson Walton Company in their 1902 booklet, achieves a tension so perfect that if a heavy weight were attached to one end, pulling the rope to its full length, quote, the weight would not turn. For such a weight, an industrialist of the period might envision loads of grain, barrels of oil, or freights of precious minerals. For a rancher, bales of wood or bundles of leather might stretch the imaginary cables. The shipper might picture cargo drawn high above the ocean, then lowered gently without rotation onto the docks below. Ropes were, of course, commonly enlisted into more nefarious service. Coiled, tangled, or laid flat, each length was potent with malice, 13 simple twists away from becoming a noose. In the Jim Crow era of vigilante violence and sexual warfare, ropes could fasten commodities as easily as they might bind arms, break necks, or strain against the turning weight of a human body. Neither the mining owner, the shipping magnate, nor the commercial rancher would expect to see such grisly functions portrayed in trade brochures, and nor would they need to. As the history of the 19th century had already proven, the means of securing capital were often indistinguishable from the mechanisms of organizing racist terror. In November 1871, the Chicago Tribune published an eyewitness account of such terror. 3 Black men, Squire Taylor, who was 45, George Johnson, who was 39, and Charles Davis, who was 68, were kidnapped from a county jail by the Ku Klux Klan and lynched in Charleston, Indiana. Aware that an impending mob was coming that night, the reporter had arranged to sleep in the sheriff's office, ensuring that he was, quote, awake at the hour of the contemplated violence. When the Klan did arrive, the sheriff refused at first to unlock the cell doors. The mob proceeded to bludgeon the jail bars with axes, sledgehammers, and chisels, quote, white heat sparks following every blow. The reporter observed how the Klansmen's eyes, quote, seemed to glow through their masks like those of famished wolves. For nearly 4 hours, Taylor, Johnson, and Davis were trapped, watching as the locks before them were battered, their executioners pounding and panning without restraint. Around 2 a.m, the sheriff decided to put an end to the jail's structural damage. He retrieved the keys from their hiding place in the back of the building, knotted on a piece of string and anchored to a window bar. The keys swung between the jail's outer walls in the bleak expanse of night. The Tribune's article was entitled Mask and Manila. The mask, of course, referred to the Klan's Muslims' hoods, while Manila referenced the, quote, brand new whitish-brown ropes used to hang the men. Each rope, it noted, had been prepared, advanced with a noose, quote, showing that someone was at work who understood his business. Manila, a fiber that Filipinos called abaca, was a derivative of the plantain plant. The fibrous bark was ideal for rope, making it one of the most valuable indigenous products of the archipelago, according to mid-19th century trade guides. Royal Spanish galleons sailing between colonial port cities in the Philippines and Mexico had used Manila rope for their rigging. Found to be sturdier, less likely to mold or to be eaten by insects, Manila imports to the United States grew precipitously after 1850, soon replacing other imported fibers like Indian jute and Russian hemp. When the abolitionist John Brown was captured in 1859, trying to spark an armed insurrection of enslaved people at Harper's Ferry, Southern states competed to deliver the rope to hang him. Kentucky's hemp rope ultimately beat out South Carolina's rope of cotton. Manila soon surpassed all these domestically grown fibers. By the turn of the century, Manila was the most popular rope-making fiber in the United States, and as headlines suggested, it was nearly synonymous with rope itself. The 1902 booklet observed that a surplus of Manila fiber was, quote, brought into our lap following the 1898 Spanish-American War and the Philippine-American War of 1899 to 1902. With those wars, the United States seized imperial control over the Philippines, obtaining a near monopoly over the country's exports, 2/3 of which consisted of Manila. Though demand for the rope-making fiber soared, especially after it was deemed strategic war material, the sustainability of the abaca supply was soon cast into doubt. Quote, the user of Manila hemp, reasoned the Waterbury Company in its 1920 catalog, is dependent entirely upon our foreign possessions in the Far East. This fraught dependence meant that, quote, the procuring of hemp for rope making is attended with some difficulty. Indeed, U.S. reliance on Manila was imperiled as Filipino workers and rebels fiercely resisted U.S. imperial policies, just as they had overthrown Spanish colonial rule from which U.S. governing practices were adapted. Catalogs of U.S. Cordage Company in the early 20th century attest to this industrial and geopolitical crisis. They agree that no solution could be found in a domestic market. Rather, for a profitable, plentiful, and stable supply of rope-making fiber, U.S. industrialists only had to look south of their border. While Manila imports declined, U.S. imports of Mexico's rope-making fibers, henequen and sisal, exploded. Primarily used as agricultural twine to bind bushels of grain and bales of hay, henequen and sisal were easily joined with other fibers to make ropes of varying widths and strengths. Derived from the spiny agave cactus, the fibers, and they were often both described as henequen, grew plentifully in the southernmost Mexican state of the Yucatan, a product of its hot and dry climate, its flat landscape, and the unrelenting input of its indigenous labor force. Beginning in the 1870s, landless Maya Indians had been conscripted to work on henequen plantations or haciendas after their commonly held lands were expropriated by the state under the regime of President Porfirio Diaz. Consigned to debt peonage, the Maya had little choice but accept labor contracts that could be sold or traded among local Yucatecan henequen capitalists or henequeneros, though rarely ever paid off. Locked into debt, henequen workers faced brutal conditions, long hours, and regular lashings with henequen whips. Henequeneros justified the beatings with the adage, los indios no hayan sino por las nalgas, the Indians only hear with their asses. In addition to exhaustion, injury, and disease, many Maya also succumbed to epidemics of suicide. In 1909, British travel writers insisted that the Henneken labor regime has cracked the indigenous workforce, quote, on a wheel of tyranny so brutal, the heart of them is dead. As demand for Henneken fiber boomed, Hennekeneros conspired with federal Mexican officials to capture workers from around the country in a coordinated plan called El Enganche, or the hook. Thousands of war dissenters, prisoners, so-called vagrants, and political dissidents, which included Huastec Indians from Veracruz and Yaqui Indians from the northern border, were ensnared. Hunted by the Mexican government, as well as by US officials, rebellious Yaquis were sent to the Yucatan haciendas in chains, declared by Diaz to be, quote, obstinate enemies of civilization. 2/3 of the Yaquis subsequently died. Barbarous labor conditions meant shortened lives for the workers and high turnover rates for the Hennekeneros. Between 1878 and 1910, labor recruiters added an additional 10,000 contract workers from Cuba, Italy, Spain, the Canary Islands, China, Japan, and Java, including nearly 3,000 from Korea. Enclosed by barbed wire, disciplined by overseers, and dependent on tiendas de raya, or company stores, which often had jail cells attached to them, Henneken plantations were effectively transformed into a vast federal prison for indentured segments of the global working class and so-called indios bárbaros, or hostile Indians. Through debt and corporal punishment, Henneken workers were forced to accept hunger, unsanitary conditions, and insufficient medical care for their children. Records also reveal that women were routinely coerced into relationships with Hennekeneros, ensuring that a threat of rape or compulsory sexual arrangements menaced every hacienda. Out of these brutal regimes, a motley international force of the criminalized, the violated, and the expropriated produced the raw material of 20th century rope. No other company benefited from Yucatec and Henneken more than the Chicago-based McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. McCormick sold agricultural machines that harvested grain and bound it into sheaves using Henneken binder twine. These reaper binder machines scaled up commercial production, enabling agribusiness in the Midwest United States to explode. And such explosions occurred alongside an intensified expropriation of indigenous land.
Okay.
Laws like the 1887 Dawes Act privatized millions of acres of communally held tribal lands in the region, enabling their settlement and agglomeration for capitalist agriculture. So through the new reaper binder technology and ongoing settler colonial violence, native territories in the Midwest were further transmogrified into the nation's breadbasket. With JP Morgan's financial backing, McCormick absorbed several major competitors, becoming International Harvester, or IH, in 1902. IH investors learned that a blend of Philippine abaca, Mexican Henneken, made ideal binder twine for Midwest grain and quickly invested in the Yucatan. By 1910, IH officials owned 99.8% of the entire Yucatecan fiber trade. In Chicago, as in the Yucatan, millionaires pressed wealth from the tangles of international misery. Aware of growing concerns over the Yucatan's labor conditions, IH officials addressed the issue in a 1910 volume of their company magazine, writing, quote, "There is nothing in the nature of slavery in the Yucatan. Every man is free and receives his pay as regularly as the workman in American factories." The statement was unwittingly ironic, given that workers had famously protested labor conditions against McCormick's Chicago factories where the reaper binder machinery was made. Demanding an 8-hour day with no cut in pay, McCormick's iron molders had joined thousands of Chicago workers and tens of thousands nationally on a general strike on May 1st, 1886, organized by the Industrial Union, the Knights of Labor. On May 3rd, 2 striking McCormick workers were killed by the police. The next day, demonstrators poured into Chicago's Haymarket Square in protest. A bomb went off during the rally and police responded by firing into the crowd. When the dust settled, several men were dead and over 100 were injured. 8 high-profile labor activists were arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder, and all 8 were convicted in a show trial designed to intimidate organized labor. 4 of the Haymarket organizers, August Spies, Albert Parsons, Adolph Fisher, and George Engel, were executed in a gruesome public hanging. Before he was hung, Spies shouted from the platform, quote, "The time will come when our silence will be more powerful than the voices you strangle today." If the Knights of Labor had organized under the slogan, "An injury to one is the concern of all," Haymarket demonstrated the maxim's global resonance. Around the world, the 1st of May became known as what, GC? May Day, or International Workers' Day. Thank you. In 1913, the Yucatan-based Casa del Obrero Mundial organized Mexico's first major May Day demonstration, complete with a Haymarket commemoration. Later, Mexican laws declared the day, quote, "a cause of pride, not only for the proletariat of the United States, but for the whole world." Writing from Mexico City in 1921, veteran labor organizer Mary Mother Jones bore witness to this solidarity. Jones was shocked to see Mexican workers enter the hall carrying the Mexican flag alongside a banner dedicated to the Chicago martyrs. The honor, said Jones, was, quote, "the most remarkable demonstration I had witnessed in all my years in industrial conflict." To this day, May Day in Mexico is celebrated as the Day of the Martyrs of Chicago. From their brutal harvest in the Yucatan to the hanging of the Haymarket organizers and back, ropes interlinked circuits of capital and empire, as well as a swell of resistance internationally rising against them. Ropes, in the tumultuous first decades of the 20th century, were often curious composites of coexisting global regimes of accumulation. Manila or abaca from US imperial control over the Philippines, cotton or domestically produced hemp from brutal Jim Crow sharecropping regimes, and henequen produced through the violent exploitation of expropriated indigenous peasants and an indebted, dispossessed global proletariat. A further understanding of the financing, the property regimes, the expropriation, the policing, the relations of social reproduction, along with the transport, storage, processing, distribution, consumption, destruction, we could go all day, of this raw material would reveal a vast interlocking universe of exploitation, expropriation, and oppression. Ropes, the ligatures of the global economy, materialize the processes by which the lives of people across disparate spaces are densely interwoven. A social history of ropes demonstrates that when capitalism links spaces, it also links the fates of the people compelled into its regimes of accumulation. As Peter Linebaugh writes in his landmark study of crime in 18th century London, the social history of hanging, quote, "must also be an economic history of the trades and the working conditions of its victims." Accordingly, a full accounting of the forces that set value in motion requires a global analysis of capital and a social history of its antagonists. You all hear that too, right? It's like, they came for the talk, okay. Ropes, through such a socio-spatial and economic history, can illuminate the movement of capital, commodities, and labor, as well as the bonds shared by Yucatecan peasants, Chicago labor organizers, dispossessed Native people, victims of Jim Crow terror, and others who might otherwise be untraceable within discreetly imagined national, racial, or ethnic histories. Unbraiding the strands of accumulation exposes obscured histories of solidarity and evinces possible futures of shared struggle. Ropes, in other words, help demonstrate how capital, geography, and histories of opposition converge. They illustrate how people have been concretely conjoined across space and how they have consequently understood their fates as interlinked within a global class struggle. The rope, therefore, that lynched Mexican rancher Antonio Rodriguez in Rock Springs, Texas on November 3rd, 1910, was tied to broader global regimes of butchery and wider currents of resistance. This rope that had bound Rodriguez to a mesquite tree that prevented his escape as he was covered with dry branches and doused with gasoline. The rope that trussed him as he was burned alive before a gaping mob of thousands. This rope, a tool of the man's trade, became a racist and gendered instrument of imperialist class power. Rodriguez was accused of killing his boss's wife, Effie Henderson, and the charge came from the boss himself, a man with an established record of aggressive violence against the woman. Like Squire Taylor, George Johnson, Charles Davis, and many others before him, Rodriguez was kidnapped from his jail cell by a mob of white vigilantes intent on exacting their own justice. Without trial or due process, Rodriguez was set on fire beneath an infinite Texas sky. A flurry of US newspapers vindicated Rodriguez's killers, hailing a common defense of the lynching, the protection of white womanhood. Lynchings were not merely forms of racist terror, but as Ida B. Wells had argued, they were also bloody rituals of aspirational authority. Lynching symbolically affirmed an order wherein white men were by law the dominant owners, heirs, and sellers of property and capital, whether or not they actually possessed property or capital themselves. This order manifested at regional, national, and international levels. The killing of Rodriguez, a Mexican foreign national, constituted a brazen flouting of international law. Less than 100 miles from the US-Mexico border, his murder represented a totality of racist terror, state power, and socio-spatial control codified through notions of gender, class, nationality, and race. The rope that killed Antonio Rodriguez was, in other words, a color line. But the rope that killed Antonio Rodriguez also drew together measures of national and international outrage. Mexican commentators challenged the moral authority of the United States, quote, progress, civilization, culture, humanitarianism, wrote revolutionary Mexican agitator and journalist Praxedes Guerrero, were ideals that were smothered in the smoke rising from Rodriguez's charred bones. Guerrero poignantly located Rodriguez's lynching, quote, on the same piece of land that has still not escaped the shadow cast by the hanging of John Brown. Demonstrators rallied in defense of Rodriguez across the United States and internationally in countries like Mexico and Cuba. Enraged leaders began calling for a boycott of US goods. Mexican demonstrators rallied at the offices of US newspapers and businesses, at the home of the US ambassador, and in the streets, often while under fire from Mexican troops. On November 12, 1910, Mexican revolutionary leader Ricardo Flores Magón described this explosion of indignation rocking Mexican cities in response to the lynching. In his internationally circulating newspaper, Regeneración, Flores Magón described how Mexican protesters had condemned Rodriguez's murder, as well as the racist violence committed against Mexicans in the United States. For Flores Magón and other Latin American commentators, this killing was in keeping with the violent encroachment of US imperialism and the avaricious behavior of US millionaires. It was racism that killed Rodriguez, and as Flores Magón noted, it was, quote, capitalism that foments racial hatred. On November 20th, 1910, not long after Rodriguez's death and the international protest against it, the Mexican Revolution officially began. During this first major social revolution of the 20th century, the economic geography of the lynch rope would unravel, and the politics of the color line would throb at the heart of the global class struggle. That's what I got.
That's right. Is it? Well, I'll mess around with it and you carry on, comrades. Well, you know what? We can see everybody at the table if you want to stay at the table.
Okay, good evening, everyone. I hope I'm audible. I can hear myself echoing. I think even the birds above can can hear me. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you. Some of my comrades and colleagues from different walks of life, different academic walks, different activist walks. So it's just a pleasure to be here with you all. I'm on this panel with people I promote as if I'm their publicist. So it is great, Sónia, your work. I have drizzled it around so many places. Your work on Guinea-Bissau in particular, I'm really excited. And Christina, it's such a joy to see this finished product and have it in not just my hand, but in the hands of movement, in the hands of history seekers, people who seek to learn from history. So I want to start off with just a couple of comments, questions, contributions, and just kind of throw it out there, because I feel like this is very much a collective discussion for all of us to be stewing on the work. Not everyone has probably read the work yet, so also hope to kind of represent some of the major takeaways as well collectively you can gather from what we're talking about. So Arise, Global Radicalism in the Era of the Mexican Revolution. This book is many things, but also serves as a collective biography rich with theoretical interventions around radicalisms, around the travels of capitalism and routes of resistance. It reframes the Mexican Revolution away from the way it's often understood as a national event. And instead, it takes us to what Dr. Heatherton calls the shadow of the shadow, that space where people converged, commiserated, and struggled, and sometimes decided that conditions could be otherwise. That's a quote from page 13. Arise focuses on revolutionary Mexico as a place, as an idea, as a projection, as seedbed of movements that inspire solidarity from activists around the world. This history is a welcome antidote to the atomization and silification of all the things, by instead focusing on convergences, intersections, and shedding light on the shadows, reminding us that anything that can be made can be unmade and remade. Thinking about the contemporary application of the work, because I feel like it's very much a book, although it's talking about events in the past, it's conversation with the present in very pivotal and key ways. So Dr. Heatherton criticizes the narrowing tendencies of American radicalism and how it can particularize struggles into discrete categories. Instead, they offer a messy and real and needed analysis of how people were thrown together, came together in convergent spaces. And I thought this was a brilliant concept for us to think about, spaces of convergence. How can we think through how contemporary struggles have engaged and converged in key ways? How can we understand how organizing space and spatial imaginaries were the building blocks of this internationalist consciousness? What are the potentials of this line of thought? And what were the pitfalls that befell the people who engaged in these practices? Intellectual heirs. In the book, we have mention of people like Peter Linebaugh, Walter Rodney. So I wanted to know more about sort of intellectual influences as a scholar, activist, inside and outside of the academy. The work engages some Black socialist feminist traditions, and later on, I will say that its engagement with gender is one of my favorite takeaways of the book, in addition to the University of the prison. So the genealogies of revolution and the tangled webs of internationalism, how do we unravel them? Where was Africa in this larger story? We saw Haiti and the Haitian Revolution, and the work brilliantly centers the Haitian Revolution as part of the US's origin story in ways that scholars have historically and more recently begun to engage. I'm thinking about Fear of a Black Republic, Haiti and the Birth of Black Internationalism by Leslie Alexander, Haiti as influence and Haiti as incubator as well. So how do we sort of bring all of that together and sort of thinking about the genealogies that help to unite and weave together these movements of struggle? There was a lot that was innovative about the methodologies employed, utilized in Arise. And it felt like the author wanted readers to take on this transnational methodology in a way that it was being offered to us, a way just not to sort of say, well, this is what I have found, but this is a new way of seeing. And if we adopt a different way of seeing, we can all see the same kinds of convergences, perhaps in where we labor as activists and as scholars. So thinking about methodology and understanding how the internationalization of capital can be seen in different realms and how it could be a way of producing an internationalist consciousness, which I thought was interesting because certainly the internationalization of capital produces quite a lot of things. But thinking about it as a fuel for a different way of seeing, of being, of knowing, of connecting was very provocative, I thought. The archives. I felt like there were many different archives at play in the work, the interdisciplinarity, the multilinguality, the transnational. These are very real strengths, I think, of the work. And most importantly, this idea of engaging social movement archives and collections that are unofficial. So I want us to think about like what are the building blocks of knowledge, and where do we get our, where do we look for to kind of build our analysis, and what gets lost when formal repositories are centered in that quest, and how are activists archiving themselves in ways that speak to the power that they want to have, hope to have, to redefine movement, right? Certainly an activist archive is not going to look like, the GC library downstairs, right? So thinking about that. One of my favorite parts of the book was the internationalism within the walls, behind the bars of Leavenworth Penitentiary, which was transformed into a university of radicalism. And some of that information and knowledge seemed to also come from surveillance files and things like that. So how do we read against the grain those archives whose intent and aim is to destroy, to distort, right? So I wanted to hear more about that. A few words on craft. I felt like in this work, rubber runs like devil's milk, hands, arms, backs, and thighs are lowered and bent. You might have gotten a sense of the poetic nature of the writing just from the part that we heard, small slice that we heard today. Dr. Heatherton takes us from scene to animated scene, from theory to historiography to geography, to speaking to the past, to gathering up the present. So I wanted to hear more about sort of a writer, the writer as activist, the imagined reader, the choices that were made as a writer. What is at stake in writing that opens doors and windows inside of it, that re-embodies flesh, and that dares to be art? Another favorite part in the book was gender. I felt like this work really unseated the unacknowledged ways that male theorists kind of center in so much of our work that is theoretically based. We met several socialist feminists whose work was being circulated, like Louise Bryant's work, like Dorothy Healy and the other women who were in unemployment councils in California, like Elizabeth Catlett. My biggest takeaway is from the chapter on making love, which is not what you think, but it's a really great piece where Alexandra Kollontai, yeah, is talking about love and comradeship. And I just wanted to put this out there in the record, right? Her definition of it, right? Love, comradeship incorporates these warm emotions, shifting love away from individual, propertied, and isolated pairings and into a collective sensibility. Love, she observed, is an emotion that unites and is consequently of an organizing character. This version of love had defined her policy work in the new Soviet state. Thinking about love and comradeship, and love united with comradeship, I felt was a major gift to movements, because oftentimes those elements are unacknowledged sites of struggle, ways that trauma gets replayed out, areas that are not politicized, right? In ways, it's not the real politics, but to give us back through the lens of this particular historical actor who defied gender norms, who spoke 11 languages, and who connected ideas about socialist feminism, this idea of love, comradeship, I felt was really key. And I would have loved to see it go even further, to think about And maybe this is the work of, work that you're asking us to do, connecting it to Black feminist theorists, other people who are theorizing about love and politics and the convergences. So thinking about these convergences are really key. One of the ways that I'm going to take away and kind of use this work is to think about the ways that people were brought together, not in defiance of their identities. They did not be their identities did not evaporate in their alliances, but instead they spoke and moved and acted from their very rooted human experiences and their human histories. And in that, they sought to make justice work and to fight against forces that felt and seemed overwhelming in ways that really pushed forward social movement. And I feel like that is the gift of Arise. It gives us a sense of the making, and it invites us to unmake. It puts flesh back on bodies. We saw that with the opening, with the reinterpretation of this horrible moment of violence to help us to unearth and to make these connections. So I wanted to leave us with that. Amen.
Okay. Okay, so good evening, everyone. I don't think I have much to say after all this presentation. So I think I'm a little bit blocked right now. But I'm very happy to be on this table, very happy to be back on the GC, which I call my second house in New York. It's always kind of goosebumps every time I see the bus arriving to New York. I'll start my reflections on the book with a quote from the book that I already mentioned to Christina that I love very much. And it starts like that. It's not by moral outrage alone that people have lent their lives to the struggle for better worlds. Neither it is for the purity of instruction from theory. There's certain no royal road, only the one made by walking. Many have walked, many have been forced to move, many have found roads while walking with others. These words is the last chapter of the book, like basically the last paragraph. The power of these words immediately resonated with me when I first heard them. Just let me put it here. The power of these words immediately resonated with me when I first heard them, and then when I read them. To explain their impact on me, I recall the words of the Brazilian singer Martinho da Vila when referring to the song Valsinha, written by his fellow musician Chico Buarque de Holanda. He said that he wrote the song that I would like to have written. And in the same sentence, and this same sentence can be applied to Christina's words. She wrote the paragraph that I would like to have written. I call this healthy academic jealous. The one that nourish us and inspire us to continue our walks, to think, to write, to relate, and in a collective way. But it's not only about walks that Arise is about, but more on how to make, unmake, create, and remake. How to make is a transversal question throughout Christina's book. Arise on learning how to make a rope, a flag, a map, a university, love, a living, a dress, and history. Mexican Revolution is the conversion space of how to make. Arise guides us to think about the importance of the small, to think and understand the big, to make and unmake. It guides us to understand how individual and collective merge or converge and their transnational ramifications of it. This constellation of local revolutions, and I'll add individual revolutions inside and with the collective, trace the histories of the Communist Party and its several understandings, and in relation, not only geographically, but also their many layers and of relations. It follows people and their relations and struggles, and presents us their stories that at the same time unveils others, forcing us to wanting to know more. One of these many layers of relations in the spaces is the spaces of education. Education is not here presented as an already made product, top down and ready to be distributed, but more on the contrary. It is presented to us on the process of building it according to the context. How to develop internationally syllabus could be another chapter of the book, although such probably will not give us the inside process of those who did it and studied. Chapter 3 on how to make a university show us how a university of radicalism was built inside the Leavenworth prison, on how to make, and I quote, insurgent prisoners repurposed the spaces of prison to engage in the labor of the radical knowledge and production. Education continues throughout the chapter 4 on how to make love, when Christina imagining and speculating about what possibly was a train ride from Alexandra Kalantoy from Porto de Veracruz to the city, give us an insight of what me and my love for train rides would call stops, or maybe what they call in Portuguese apiadeiros, today small train stops in the countryside. Here we are presented with a landscape of the ride and the country with 7 stops, being one of the stops called I can call the education stop, of when, and I quote, schools became centers where communities organized around issues of public health, child caring, public sanitation, and later the municipal projects. And teachers became the linchpins of the new social development, working as community organizers along the campesinos associations and workers movements, end of quote. Later, this continued, but this time now in Harlem. Again, education became another layer of this conversion space, where pedagogy and protest aligned together with Elizabeth Catlett. On that teaching, on what teaching meant making political decisions about the world one lived inland, the world of those who refused to reproduce it. George Washington Carver's school, and here I make the parallel with Amilcar Cabral, as both of them were agronomists, brings to us another continuity of the educational spaces in this book. As an historian of education, my eyes tend to automatically look for these spaces of education. Arise gives us many other examples of education, sometimes not in the way that we are open to receive. It allows us to think education and internationalists as they walk and develop hand in hand, and the making of the schools. But I don't want to focus here only on education, but I want to mention on the writer and the style, and the impact and how poetic, I mean immersive, Christina's writing is. Within each chapter, we are taking by almost in-motion photographic description of the history that Christina is sharing it with us. Visually, it is almost cinematic. In these immersive descriptions, and not only history that is being shared by word, but in relation with how writing and images and imaginaries bring us out to read this book, and how the writers make the reading so exciting. To give you an example, and one of my favorite quotes, passages in the book, and this has to be, again, with the train ride or the Flores Magón, on his final trip to Mexico. Christina writes, when Ricardo Flores Magón finally crossed back into his beloved Mexico after nearly 20 years of exile, he was in a coffin. The train carrying the revolutionary body passed from El Paso, Texas, into Juarez, Mexico on January 5th of 1923. Along rail lines that reached across the country interiors works gathered to pay their respects. In Chihuahua, crowds massed in the doffed hats and red banners. In Torreon, a rally grew so fervent that nearby Americans consul locked himself inside. By the time it reached Aguascalientes, many of the funeral train had lost their voices from all the speeches and shouting along the way. After his odyssey across the country, the casket, draped in red and black flags and fastened with flowers and lanterns, pulled into the Mexico City station. Hundreds solemnly received the body and in a 20-block long procession organized by the Railroad Workers Union, declared an anarchist event in death. So this is one of the passages that I find very poetic on how one can write in almost in a cinematic way that forces us not just to read these words, but also to imagine and to feel the warmth or the cold of what might happen in this process. And one of the questions that I have for Christina is like for her to talk, if she could talk more about the archive of the unwritten, like and to think about the archives that we collect along the way, but not just the archive that we just go in a special place to have access to it, but also how was the process of arriving to these archives and how many archives you went through it to get to this process of writing. And another aspect is to think about education and internationalism. It is spread out throughout the book, but there is no chapter around it. And I would like to know more about how education almost can be understood as a central piece in this process, but in the same way you avoid to write it about a chapter is only on that topic. Thank you so much for.
Hello, hello. Can you hear me up there, birds? Yeah, okay. So first off, I'm quite embarrassed. I should have said this at the beginning. I think I skipped over a whole paragraph. I want to profoundly thank the two people on my left who have just commented on the work. When Mary and Ruthie and Lucian asked catch this, who in New York City would you like to be in conversation with? What an invitation. I live in Connecticut. That's like, wow. I said, I mean, these are the two people. So it like my heart's exploding right now to be at this table. I'm stammering. I'm so excited. I've learned so much from your work, Robyn. I've taught your work. The first and only time I was on a dissertation committee with you, I remember being kind of awestruck and just being like, I can't believe I'm supposed to be like on a committee with you. So, if anybody has taught me so much about gender and social movements and also the messiness of the archive, it's you and your work. So I'm deeply grateful for everything that you've done. And I'm so excited about the new work with Patricia Rodney's archive. So thank you. And Sónia, I mean, sometimes you get to be really lucky and you get to be a fan of someone that you're also friends with. So I've known Sónia. I feel like, you're the closest to Kalanta I know. I feel like every time we meet up, I ask you again how many languages you speak, just in case you picked up an extra one. So, you plan to, of course. So, Sónia's work as a scholar, as a filmmaker, as a writer, as an artist, the compliment of having you talk about it as being cinematic, it's like, I'm like quite blushing. I'm such a big fan of your work and the way that you particularly think about the archives, walking with the archives, for the two of you, this question of how do you find archives of social movements, which definitely, aren't at the Library of Congress. They're not kept like the Rockefeller archives. These are, we have to reimagine ways of finding archives, of, reading archives, as you said, against the grain. So I deeply appreciate you both being here and your engagement. So I don't know, you've all seen me up here. I tried to write everything down. There was a lot of questions and I won't get to all of them, but I'll do my best. I think, maybe I'll just say a little bit about some things that came up in both your comments and say a little bit about the book for those of you who haven't read it. So the key concept of the book is convergent space, which a few people have mentioned. And so these are sociospatial sites where disparate radical tradition are compressed in struggle and produce new articulations of struggle, which is kind of a fancy way of saying that anybody who's organized anything knows that there's a kind of like foundation where everybody has to figure out who's in the room, where are you coming from, how do you understand change, what sort of traditions are you drawing on, and how do we make sense of that together? So, I think this is something that I'd encountered again and again, and it was something that I was forced to make meaning of in the text, and particularly in the archive. So one chapter that I think everybody mentioned, which is kind of about education, which is called How to Make a University, but yes, is not how to make education, is a chapter about Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. And so what this chapter is it looks at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, which was the largest federal penitentiary during World War I. There was this problem the federal government had of arresting all of these political dissidents, and they'd go to Leavenworth and they would leave as organizers. And part of the problem was that political dissent in this period, with laws like the Espionage and Sedition Act, they made political dissent a federal crime. So you go to a place like Leavenworth and you have who's who of everybody in the world are locked up together. So Mexican revolutionaries, but also anarchists, communists, pacifists, nationalists, members of the Ghadar movement fighting British colonialism in India, and so I went just because I thought of this puzzle, right, from the passage you read. How was it that Ricardo Flores Magón, one of the greatest agitators, journalists, of the Mexican Revolution, died in Kansas? How come Kansas gets to claim that, right? And so I went to the National Archives Central Plains region just to find that story. And in the process, I had to reckon with the fact that everybody was there at the same time, right? And not only were they all there together, but they were talking to each other. They were organizing together. And in order to organize together, they had to learn together. So in the process of trying to organize, first, just within the walls of the prison, for more humane treatment, for the ability not to be tortured, not to be starved. And then, thinking beyond the prison walls for the movements they came from, they had to teach each other. And so a federal surveillance file found that the prisoners had actually produced a university there, right? And so in the process of just trying to find Flores Magón's stories, I found this incredible story of a university that these radicals had built behind walls, where they were talking about the different revolutionary movements that they were coming from, that they were educating each other in really creative ways. Sometimes it was creative stories that they were talking about different revolutionary movements. Sometimes it was just historical lessons. And so I thought that this was just such a rich story that helped reframe how we thought about revolutions in the period. This was a material version of a convergent space. But I'll say a few things about it just because the question of the archives came up, and the discovery was as much a one of just kind of sitting there with the papers, where Shannon understands, right? And it was also very tactile. So I was looking through the different mugshots of the prisoners, and I was looking specifically for the ones that I knew, the Mexican revolutionaries who were there by their number, and my finger kept sticking on some of the pictures, right? And I ignored it first, but it kept happening again and again. And so I was like, what's happening? And it turned out that some of the pictures were stuck together, right? And I had to stop and think about this. And what this meant was that whenever a prisoner was arrested, paroled, and then rearrested for violating parole, they had a new mugshot taken, right? And so these were all, my finger was sticking on the pictures of men who had been arrested again and again. And the other fact was they were all Black. And these were all men from the Houston Mutiny in 1917, right? And so, as Khalil Muhammad work and many other people's work have shown us, like, this was an earlier moment in the racialization of the federal prison system. And you could see it just, you know, you have all these radicals being arrested, but it's these Black prisoners from the Houston Mutiny who were arrested again and again. And I had to deal with this quite haunting fact. You could see these people aging in prison, you know, they were arrested as young men who had been a part of, who had enlisted in the military. And their last picture, their third or sometimes their fourth picture was quite a ghostly old image. And so I mentioned that by way of saying a few things. One, you know, I say in the book that as much as I'm thinking about convergences of radical traditions, sometimes we have to expand what we mean by radical and revolutionary traditions to think about things like the Houston Mutiny. And you both asked me the question about methods and archives. So I'm trained, you know, formally and I'd say informally in the tradition of history from below, social history, right? And Marcus Rediker told me a long time, if you want to tell the story, if you want to tell people's history, if you want to tell the history of working class and poor people, you have to go to the places where the records are kept. Those are the welfare rolls. Those are prison records. Those are, sometimes you have to go to potter's fields, you know, but you have to be imaginative to think about people whose records aren't, you know, as formally kept. And so sometimes that means you follow somebody who has an easily traceable story into the archive in order to tell the story of the world of the people around them. And so as much as that, as the story of the University of How to Make a University and the story of Leavenworth Penitentiary is about convergences, and they're beautiful convergences, you know, I mean, it's really extraordinary to think about how these people taught and learned from one another, how this was imprinted in the ways they articulated their struggle after the fact. But the chapter as well as the book is not just this fanciful story of like, hey, we did it, you know, everybody converged, because we'd be living in a much different world if we did. So Robyn, your first question was about present day application. And I want to say that as much as the book is about convergences, it's also about those convergences that didn't congeal. It's about what I talk about as the subjectivities of the, well, what Du Bois described as the subjectivities of the new imperialism, right? How people were bought off, how people began to think about themselves as the financiers, as the small shareholders of empire, he called them, right? How, you know, I talk about this emergent hegemonic project wherein the specific interests of financiers in these period get successfully expressed as in the general interest, right? Mm-hmm. And so as much as I'm talking about the convergences that congealed, I'm also talking about all the places in which people took the seduction out. They said, you know, for example, I tell the story of Langston Hughes's father, right? You're gonna have to stop me because I just like, I'll tell this and then I'll shut up. So everybody knows the famous poem, Langston Hughes's poems about rivers, right? A Negro Dreams of Rivers, right? But how many of you know that he wrote it while he was in a train going to Mexico to see his father? In The Big Sea, one of Hughes's memoirs, he talks a lot about how meaningful it was to understand his father, relationship to indigenous people in Mexico. His father was a small property owner in Mexico. He had aspirations of being a hacienda owner there. And Hughes talks about these extraordinary ways in which for himself, he comes to triangulate that experience and understand something about US racism, watching how his father is treating indigenous Mexican people in Mexico, trying to be a big man, you know? He's afforded opportunities in Mexico that he can't have in the United States. So his choice in the revolution isn't solidarity. He doesn't say, oh, I'm with the Mexican peasants, you know, I'm with this struggle, with this revolution. He says, I'm going to take advantage of it and get the gains that I'm denied in the United States. So I just, you know, I think at this moment, Du Bois's insights, which he articulates in many places, but among them in the African roots of war. And I totally agree. There's a lot more that I could do with just how he's analyzing Africa to make this point. But he's thinking about what does it mean when the seductions to identify yourself with power, right, are far exceed what it would mean to ally yourself and to find solidarity or internationalism with people who share your conditions, right? I feel like that continues to be the struggle. So as much as this book is a model of how we can think differently, how we can imagine convergences, how we can build them, this is very much at the front of my mind at this moment and in the process of writing the book, that we have to have a vision that's bigger than the forces that are arrayed against us. We have to find meaningful ways of establishing solidarity, because right now we're getting our ass kicked in terms of the forces, you know, that intensify the things that make us different. That's probably not the best way to say it, but that's what I'm thinking about. So I'll stop there and then we can keep talking.
Sure. Well, why don't we open up to the in-person audience? We have a mic that can move around. And also I'll check and see if we have any questions in the chat. While somebody asks a question from the house. Okay, House, you got it.
Good evening. I could appreciate history teacher teaching Mexican Revolution. And I can appreciate the globalization of the revolution that you just gave us, particularly from the financial standpoint, looking at McCormick and really deconstructing McCormick in the agribusiness, or the early 20th century agribusiness. And could you possibly explain more about the agribusiness, McCormick's role, and how it translates to the furthering of settler colonialism here? Because we talk about the Mexican Revolution, we centered it in Mexico. You've given us a chance to look at it globally. Talk about that connection, more about the connection between McCormick, agribusiness here, disparate communities that were affected by it. And I mean, I got more questions, but I'll just stop there.
You want to take a few questions? Yeah.
Hi, Christina. What really struck me thinking about the book today is a question about your how you're thinking about the relationships between organizers of many varieties, professional revolutionaries who are moving around the world and who are being called into situations and who are finding themselves drawn into situations, and the communities, whether we think of them as base communities or the masses that are organizing themselves in certain scenarios, and how that relates to your method of presentation, how you chose in some chapters to focus on a figure pretty centrally, how other chapters you focused on a sort of host of different figures coming from different places to sort of emphasize the convergence, and how other chapters, like in the chapter on Dorothy Healy, it's kind of barely about Dorothy Healy. You know, you use her as this way in, and then you very quickly make the point that the Communist Party was asked to bring in organizers by people who had a long history of engagement and struggle. So it wasn't that they thought that they didn't know what they were doing, but they did want to bring in people with a certain set of skills, and in the process, they changed that person. So I'm sort of interested in how you were thinking about those dynamics and the many shapes that they take, and how you tried to show that through the sort of literary devices of having a character describing their relationship, or having a character and then pulling away from them onto the background that could be the backdrop of their story, but is really the story you want to tell, and those dynamics. Because I think it's really interesting, and you're doing a lot of different things at different points in the book.
Take one more. Maybe start there.
Hi, Christina. I really enjoyed reading the book. It's not yet finished. And also today's conversation. And I was thinking about, that time in early 20th century and how all these people were connected, as, you were saying and Patrick saying. And I was thinking there seems to have been a permeability across struggles that seems to be missing at this point. And I feel that at that time, nation states were weakly formed. In fact, capitalist relationships in the third world was weakly formed, which is not the case right now. So that, how far have we traveled at this point in terms of the spreading of the idea of state and capital being central to, how, and also in that sense, I was thinking about this seductions of power. And at that time, actually, many of them wanted power for people, but it also means that power to a certain section.
Okay, all right, no easy questions from the Graduate Center. So let me give it back to you. In the Grundrisse, I'll mangle this quote a little bit. Marx says something to the effect that the method of investigation has to be different than the mode of exposition, right? So the way that you come to learn something is different from the way you represent it or express it. And I find that's particularly true in writing a book, like you have to, one of our Brazilian friends, I've had a beautiful expression about like, don't give away the gold, right? Your reader wants to see the treasure. They don't want to see the treasure map, right? And so there are a number of choices that I think the first two questions really nail about like, what were choices that I had to make in order to tell a kind of complicated story, right? So the first, the opening, how to make a rope, is just trying to give a way into the kind of analysis. How do you tell a story about something you already know or people already know? And how do you defamiliarize the familiar? So for me, as soon as I found this fact about Haymarket and International Workers' Day, I was like, okay, well, this kind of changes things. Instead of this just being a Chicago story, right? How do we think about what they were making in the McCormick factory, right? And how do we think about the fact that the binder twine was coming from Mexico, that the conditions that precipitated the Mexican Revolution were also part of what happened in Chicago? And so there's a whole way in which I'm trying to set up the argument about the internationalization of capital help produce an internationalist consciousness, right? So, the chapter, that's kind of as much as I say about rope in the chapter. I've gotten criticized for that from rope experts who are like, but I'd like to read a little bit more. So, but it's just an opening. It's just an opening. So I would, it's not my forte. It's just the rope community is enraged. But I would say that Tony Gilpin has wrote a fantastic book called The Long Deep Grudge about international harvesters. So if you're interested in that, I would turn to this fantastic book. Now, for the question about, this is a really great question, Patrick, about organizers and thinking about different ways in. So, I think, you gave me the best compliment of the book. I've really, made up for getting canceled by the rope community. When you said this book is principally non-sectarian. And I really pride myself on that, so the book does move through different sectarian histories, but it doesn't belong to any one of them. And part of this was just, I thought, extremely important to say at this moment that there's an anachronistic way that we can talk about political traditions as always becoming the thing that they became, which is just, it's like, it freezes them. It makes, as I say in the conclusion, politics is something to which fidelity and loyalty is pledged rather than something messy that we make, right? Mm-hmm. And so a lot of the choices that I make in the book were to not just tell, here's the history of the Communist Party, or here's the history of the Wobblies and the anarchists, but to show how messy those entanglements were in the period, because I think I want everything to be an invitation and opening, I think particularly at this moment, it's a terrifying moment of uncertainty. And so a lot of the reactionary forces just propose something that feels certain. And I think on the left, we have our own variant of that, right? where we can lean on things that feel hardened and certain and radical and redemptive. And actually, I think the same problem persists if those aren't open. If we start worshiping revolutionary heroes rather than doing the kind of messy, uncertain work of politics, we're really screwed. I'll just, I've got a lot to say about that, which I'd be happy to talk with you more about. But I wanted to maybe mention that in relationship to this last question, which I think is really fantastic. And I'll address this question about nation states and capital by talking a little bit about something else that I do in the second chapter, which I tell the story of one of the founders of the Mexican Communist Party, who was named M.N. Roy, who was from India, who was he was a militant fighting British colonialism in India. And, for reasons that surprised even him, he found himself in Mexico in 1917. He describes it in his memoir as the land of my rebirth, right? And he talks about how he goes from being a diehard nationalist to an internationalist. And part of it is he's invited by radicals in Mexico to describe the struggle of Indian people against British colonialism to a Mexican readership. And he has this great quote where he says, explaining the situation would be like carrying coal to Newcastle, like these were iterations of similar struggles. And so he says he becomes an internationalist. And what's so fascinating is a lot of people know M.N. Roy because of his debates with Lenin in the Comintern on the national colonial question, right? Where he makes, in line with your question, these very provocative arguments about why it is that the Comintern is supporting struggles in the industrialized world that are led by the proletariat. But in the colonized world, you're supposed to make alliances with the petty bourgeoisie, right? And Roy, among many, says, why are there two different sets of rules? And why wouldn't the same circumstances come to pass? Why are you discrediting the workers in the colonies, in, as you said, these emerging nation states? Why can't you see that they could be actors with, with similar possibilities for self-determination and leadership, right? And what's fascinating about that is the writings that prefigure his interventions in the Comintern you can find in his writings in Mexico. So, so the end. So I'll stop there.
More questions? No, don't be afraid. No such thing as a bad question unless I say it.
I can say one other thing if in response to, nope, I won't. Barbara Winslow, please.
Please use the mic. Sorry.
You know how much I love the book, and in all my years of study, so many connections. So I'm going to try just say something about archives. Robyn knows some of the work we've done at Brooklyn in creating a Shirley Chisholm archive. But what I'm finding in some of the research I'm doing is that activists are creating local archives everywhere and different kinds of archives. I was particularly inspired by Manning Marable and the Malcolm X collection, by Sarah Schulman's Act Up, by I'm getting older, Candace Fawkes, Emma Goldman Project. They're now archives that are dealing with so many wide ranges of different experiences. And I think when I visited some of them, so many of them are done by local political activists. And I think this is an extremely important contribution. And I just remember as, an activist in the 60s, nobody saved their materials because we were always worried that the FBI would come and bust us, or we had no sense of what that we were doing was important. And I saved 4 boxes of God knows what. It's all now in the University of Washington archives for a book I finished. But I
beg younger scholar activists to save as much as possible, because it is going to be so important for the next generation of activists to look at, to see. And I think the most important thing is that you see you're not alone in all the struggles that you have described. So thank you. This is such a fabulous book.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And I also just want to piggyback on that comment and talk about the importance of oral history. So Barbara Winslow and I, though she's verified by looking through the acknowledgements that we know everybody in common, including potentially the 8th grade boyfriend of your daughter. Ah, yes. Okay. Got it. We got in contact because she heard I was writing something about Catlet and got in touch and said I knew her. And so I interviewed, and thankfully you did it just before I was submitting the book, and I was able to include some facts from our interview in the book. And I just want to say that, you know, I think something that Robyn and Sónia and Ruthie all know intimately is how to think about archives and oral history and how important those things are together. So, you know, the image on the cover of the book is by Elizabeth Catlett. She's somebody who's everywhere and whose story is also, as I say, hidden in plain sight. She's, you know, her biographer, Melanie Herzog, says she's probably one of the most important artists of the 20th century. And something unlocked in her story for me by talking to people, because she's everywhere. You know, Dale Gore's Radicalism at the Crossroads also has Catlett's image on the cover, and she's there with, you know, so many radical Black organizers in the United States and radical organizers of, you know, in Mexico, people who are fleeing all kinds of repressive regimes and staying at her house. But her political biography hadn't been told. And one very important oral history that I did was with her friend Gwendolyn Midlow Hall, who's, you know, had been married to the Black Bolshevik, that's the name of his memoir, Harry Haywood. And I was able to talk to her before she passed, and she was insistent on saying, you know, it's time to tell the truth about who she was, about her politics, about all the things that she was actively a part of, not just something she was illustrating, right? And just having the permission from people who knew her, like you, to say, like, look, this woman's a badass, right? You need to, like, think about all the archives you're encountering with that knowledge, change the ways you see the archive. So it's not just that we have to keep track of our movement history. We have to, you know, treat it with reverence, but we also have to think about new ways to engage with it. And so just having the permission to think about her as an organizer, as someone who was quite a fierce organizer, changed the way I saw everything. So you can also read the archives differently when it's complemented with oral history.
Christina, beautifully written and researched. I wanted to ask you about this trope of making, because it seems to me that it not only makes an appeal to various forms of agency, but reflexively, it also throws light on the hard work that you've done yourself in the making of the project, right? So I see it operating at a couple of levels. One, in making connections between the things that are made, and at a second level, as a heuristic about how one makes connections oneself as an activist scholar, you know, in the process of the research, right? So you're incredibly generous in the acknowledgements. You know, I think there are hundreds of names there, but so, I mean, it's almost literally a collective project. But I do think that it's not just the surface of the text that is about making, but the internal logic of the text that is also encouraging that kind of agency of connection.
This is sort of a question, sort of a comment, but just to take what you said and what Christina said a few moments ago, one step further, that this making requires us to notice how, this is quoting you from something you said earlier, how in the messiness, people in it noticed and made, right? So it's not just a step back how they made this, but how they made this. And that recapitulation, if you will, is one of the most, for me, astonishing accomplishments of this book. Whether or not I'd ever write that in a review, it blows my mind how well you did that. Okay.
I'm a fumble through this. All right, so like I'm gonna sweat the book another time. I'm gonna sweat your book another time because we have time to do that. But what I do want to say right now is this thing about convergent space and thinking about it like as an organizer and thinking about convergent space, like, you know, consciously saying not intersectionality, but convergent space. What am I trying to say here? Because thinking of it like as an organizer, part of like my own experience is trying to find the ways that the things that touch us, you know, like common denominators, right? So like thinking about, you know, how much of like the borough that I live in is becoming immigrant, like competing with Queens almost, you know what I'm saying, become like an immigrant town, and like thinking about, you know, African-American history and the Great Migration, like, or thinking about that as like an immigrant story or a refugee story as a way to like align Black Americans in NYCHA, for example, with the Poblanos who are like moving in, you know what I'm saying? And like, when I read your book and like, you know, this word convergent space because sometimes I think the way that intersectionality gets talked about in practice is a way of like parsing out difference rather than bringing together. And I don't mean like, and I'm not trying to say that convergence, because you say it very carefully in the book, like this is not to be like some melting pot bullshit, but like, you know, so like, I really appreciate the ways that you are bringing things that, like you said, like we know kind of already that is familiar to us, but like linking them to each other, like how I just gave the example about Great Migration and like, you know, like linking shit together, like the Haymarket to Mexico or like M. Roy to Mexico, like this. And that's where I find like the possibility in the book as not a guide, ain't nobody guiding shit, you know what I'm saying? But like as a way for us to imagine that the possibilities are still here, you know what I'm saying? Because like it's literally still on the ground happening right now. So like it's lit. I'm gonna tell you more another time.
Well, I thank you for all the comments and points. And I'll say, Shalene and I will be in dialogue this Thursday at the PPO gallery down the street for your incredible exhibition. And we're talking 6 to 8, 6:30, something like that. It's online. But since the questions of, you know, how do we think about intersectionality? How do we think about the messiness of the archive? How do we think about the relationship with social movements and what they imagine, what they allow us or, you know, to imagine in the present? It feels like I really want to give this question to Robyn and Sónia, because I think both of your works do so much to think about all of these concepts and questions. So I wanted to do it after Barbara's question, but if you had any thoughts about the comments, particularly, you know, how do we think about the archives? How do we think about intersectionality? How do we think about the messiness of them? You know, how do we curate them? I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts.
I feel like there's a moment in your, I think it's your first chapter, maybe the rope, where you talk about sort of holding things still in a moment and looking at it. And then also sort of releasing it and looking at it in motion. And I feel like that is so much of what is required in order for us to think about movement building, movement histories, etc. And I think about that with how we even categorize things, new left, you know, feminists, women, LGBTQI+, all of these as separate entities almost. And so we, you know, theorists come up with words, intersectionality, to really embody the fact that it's sort of all layered there together, you know, in a way, and to think about why that's important and how do we learn that, I think is really key. And oftentimes I think as, you know, scholars or people who are writing about something, we're taught to like sort things, and we're taught to order things and to put them, that's the way you have to, that's what your job is to put it in order and be able to say something. And even if what you're saying is not necessarily how it was, you know, your ability to bring it together is what you're going to be sort of validated on. And I think this question of archive allows us to think differently about that, especially archives that are coming directly from movements, archives that are tangible and material in ways that you mentioned when you're going through the photographs, and the ones that stick to our hands, the ones that don't get swallowed easily, the ones that open up what seem to be contradictions. But when we hold them up against the things that we know, they're just the way that, you know, I think the way that life works. I think we've moved away from the kitchen table, from the knowledges that we have in our lives, from our communities, from how we navigate the world. And instead we think of sort of this process of writing and researching to be something that's sort of scientific-y. And I think, you know, I just encourage people, I think like Christina, like you went back to the heart of the matter. I felt like there was heart, there was feeling in what you gave us. And the archives that you utilize allow you to say that. And those archives utilize you too, right? The archives that utilized you to kind of tell these stories. You know, in some ways we're in this call and response, and we just have to listen and not assume our own centrality in the process.
No, I agree with what Robyn just shared. And for example, with the PAIGC, when the idea of the archive is not enough. For example, the PAIGC archives, they were moved from Guinea-Conakry to Guinea-Bissau. And through this process, some of the material got lost in the river. And then it got destroyed in '98 during the Civil War. And then it was reorganized in Portugal by a Portuguese institution, and it's there that is located right now. So, and throughout my research, when I realized that the archives were not enough, I unconsciously found myself interviewing people. And it was only after the research that I started to realize, oh, actually I had an archive. I was interviewing an archive. And I was not just interviewing the archives, I was living with the archive, walking, cleaning, cooking, eating, and so on. So, and all of that helps to understand like the messiness of the archive, because the information that is given in one day might be not the full one. On the next day will come and they will add some other information that they didn't feel comfortable to share the day before. And that shows like the feelings of the archive that's why I call it the walking archives, like it's not constant. So yeah, I think it's important to look around and see what kind of archives are there, and what kind of idea of the archive we have that we have somehow to dismantle, and where we can find the information.
More questions?
Thank you. Just want to share again, congratulations on producing this book. And yeah, this is an amazing panel. I respect all of your work so much. I want to bring in a question about two of the themes in the book that I really was trying to grapple with and understand more, specifically convergent spaces and love comradeship. And there was a few people here who were part of a reading group on this book last in the fall. And gratitude to Lucy and Brian for bringing that together. And you spoke about the stickiness of some of these photographs. I feel like the stickiness of those two concepts was something that we were reflecting on with each other, specifically some fruitful debates on, in particular, convergence spaces, there being this question of how to create convergence spaces that are not sectarian, where people from different kinds of organizing sensibilities or movement histories find themselves thrown into the same space. But also there being the need for hashing out like really clear kinds of debates on strategy or on next steps, and that in those hard debates, people can stay non-sectarian. So I'm wondering, just, with the chapter on Leavenworth Prison or elsewhere, if you could talk a little bit more about like how to facilitate through a convergent space like that, in order to really draw out the most of what people are all bringing into it. And, in movement, not shying away from debate for fear of being sectarian. And the second question is around love comradeship. I think another sticky point of the study group was thinking about how, sometimes when people come into movement, there's a real sense of people's heart being open and bringing in a lot of, their previous heartbreaks, their attachment styles, all kinds of stuff coming into movement. And the question of how to create love comradeship in a way where everyone doesn't have to be everyone else's bestie, but people treat each other with deep, deep integrity. And I feel like the way that Kollontai in the chapter on Kollontai and love spoke a lot about the revolutionary organizing potential of love. And wondering if, you could share a little bit more just like on the facilitating how love comradeship can come into movement spaces. Just, some more tangibles on those two concepts.
Well, thanks so much for the question. And I was able to sit in with the reading group last semester, which was really, really wonderful down here and now Reclaim the Commons. So thank you all for who engaged with the work. So maybe I'll just say a few things about Alexander Kollontai and this love everybody wants to talk about. I gave the first book talk I gave in California. There was this, I showed the slide and said these are all the chapters. And I immediately had this old woman who looked very nice, who was like a heckler. And she was like, I was like, and now I'm going to talk about how to make whatever. And she said, I want to know about how to make love. I was like, okay, all right, lady. So how to make love is, it's a chapter that thinks about Alexander Kollontai, who was the Soviet diplomat. She was the diplomat from the Soviet Union to Mexico for a very short period of time, the end of 1926 to just the, first half of 1927. And it's a kind of odd choice to make, right? The Mexican Revolution, oh my God, it's like rollicking with internationalism. This should have been the chapter about Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo and, Mayakovsky and all the international artists who actually came to the Soviet embassy when it was run by Kollontai's predecessor. This is where, they planned magazines, they planned art. Concha Michelle would come and sing radical music. This was like, people were like, why wasn't this your convergence space? Why'd you tell this depressing story that happened afterwards? But it's because of these struggles over love comradeship. So Kollontai is such an interesting figure. She's one of the first women ever appointed to a state cabinet, full stop, right? Any state cabinet. And she was the Commissar of Social Welfare under Lenin. So part of the way that she develops this idea of love comradeship, it comes from a lot of her organizing, particularly with women, which is to say, like, her understanding of the massive social revolutions of her period came from seeing how it was Russian women who led textile strikes, that were the predecessors of 1905 revolution. It was seeing German women, who similarly were organized in textile industries. And so, she's not thinking about women as a kind of like silent accessory to a revolutionary movement, but as the vanguard. And in her position as Commissar of Social Welfare, it's a fascinating position because it forces her to interrogate the limits of heteropatriarchy of organizing society around nuclear families, right? Her charge is to think about the orphans, the divorced women, the single women, the elderly, the injured, the people who, the veterans from war, like people who like are unattached largely from the nuclear family model. And so in this very early moment of the building of the Soviet Union, she's having to think there's a big problem. If we're not already problematizing questions of gender, sexuality, and the organization of the family, then we are producing a society that already has all these people left out, injured. How is that revolutionary? That seems to just reproduce the very thing we overthrew. So it's fascinating for this brief period of time. And it's because, you know, she's a part of the left opposition. So Stalin essentially sends her to Mexico as an outpost to be like, how about you cool off over there and think about what you did? That she, you know, is all of a sudden thrust into this other, you know, early revolutionary state that's trying to think about this very unsexy question, right? The question of how do we get to revolution is enormously sexy. And like you said, you know, there's a way that we have great masculinist fantasies about, you know, we're going to have the red flag, we're going to stand up to our oppressors, but who takes care of the orphans, right? And so, you know, part of this train ride that you asked me to talk about was just a way of getting you to see what she saw and what she might have seen, right? What did it mean for her? You know, like there are extraordinary stories of all the orphan children in Mexico, right? That, I mean, for me, reading about Kalantai's work, I was like, these had to have been very similar to all the crowds of orphaned Russian children, right? That she suddenly had to take charge of, right? And so I was interested in this early moment of imagining a new state, right? Because it's within that Kalantai is theorizing like both a new form of social organization, but the ballast of it is this concept of love, comradeship. She said we have to have a different definition of love in order to organize society differently. So, I mean, how do we do it? I mean, aren't we, you guys are doing it, right? You know, I mean, the question of reclaim the commons isn't just like, how do you just, you know, get better wages or better conditions for doing the kind of work that you do? You're thinking about childcare. You're thinking about feeding people. You know, you're thinking about healthcare. I think this is the most meaningful thing at this moment is that love, comradeship does seem to be at the center, right, of what we imagine as labor struggles. And they're pushing those labor struggles to say, what do we mean when we think about labor? Is it just the wage or is it all the conditions, you know, that reproduce the worker themselves? So, you know, I mean, I think that this is something, maybe this is, I don't mean for this to be a dodge, but I do feel like this is at the center. Like our struggles at this moment are so existential. So if people are thinking about survival, if we're all being forced to think about collective survival, we are having to ask similar questions that Kalantai was asking about how do we reorganize society so we don't end up with the same kind of exclusions that we already have.
Can I ask you a question? So, I mean, I have read your book, but I still would like you to noodle on this. So what do you think love is? Like, I mean, we were talking last week, me and Shalene and some people, about how the great thing about small c communism is that it is extensive enough to meet the needs of people I despise. But that might be, it might be that in order to be able to develop something like that, something called love would have to infuse the development of systems and capacities and institutions and so forth. So I'm just curious what you and Sonia and Robyn think. About love.
I'm genuinely going to open that up to the two of you. And I want you all to see, did you see that? That's what it's like to have Ruth Wilson Gilmore as your dissertation advisor, right? I'd have to think a lot about that. I don't think I have any quick answer, but I'm sure by the time Robyn and Sónia talk.
His star pupil, notice this.
What is it? Well, is it daily? I believe it's daily. yeah, to think about love, I think is a daily thing that it's not just, well, it's daily, it's a practice, or and it can be very pragmatic. And is intentional. It has to be very intentional. That's how I think about love. And if we bring those three elements to love and comradeship, I think, yeah, I think they can be seen together in a daily practice, very intentional, with a purpose, and not just in a very fluffy way that normally is described as.
Oh my goodness, okay. I mean, the 60s activists talked a lot about love, all the while being very hateful to themselves and sometimes others, who would be their potential comrades even. I think that's the reality of it. I think it's a great question because movements in human history have not been able to always center themselves in that kind of ethic. And I mean, that's what I want to offer. I'm currently writing about a therapist, Pat Robinson, and she talked a lot about the traumas of remaining politically engaged at a time of violence and, you know, repression, much less the more individual things that we think about that are happening in our family and our relationships. She connected all of that to structure. And she did talk about, you know, this question of love as something that was relational, something that was ethical, something that allowed for difference. And even I'm thinking about the Panthers in particular, they talked about comradeship a lot. And, you know, people called each other comrades and things like that. The ideal of a comrade was that we didn't have to necessarily like each other, but we were united in a political mission. And so we had each other's back, you know, in those moments and in all of what that meant. But I think adding love to comradeship is actually very revolutionary, because I think that it requires more than that, because the comradeship did not allow for the type of self-questioning that I feel that comes along with love, the type of making, I mean, thinking about making love, the idea that love has to be constantly made, replenished, plugged in. It's not a feeling or a destination or a moment. It's something that you constantly have to work towards. And I think it's a difficult thing. You know, I've been thinking about Bell Hooks' work on, you know, love politics and ideals about that. And I'm still kind of grappling with all of what that means in political context, because I don't know if I can, you know, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. I can't love everyone. I don't want to. Even ethically, you know, it's not that I want to, you know, plan their destruction, but sometimes I do if they're trying to destroy me, right? And the things I care about, the things that are right and just and all of that. So it you know, there's that kind of ethical element. I think this is one for the philosophers. I don't know.
I really,
Peter often has really,
you
he
snuck
snuck
out.
out. Okay, really deep ideas. Yeah.
Well, I really like this idea of the tension that you're drawing out in love, comradeship, as if they're similar words, they have different weight, and there's different kinds of accountability. There's a different kind of action involved in each of them. And I, you know, initially I was thinking about the words that the two of you have used in thinking about your own relationship to the archive, your relationship to social movements that have come before. You've talked about listening, you've talked about looking, you've talked about walking, you talked about noticing, right? Kind of having an awareness of the, this difficult work and the ways people have tried and failed and messed up, but, made things possible for us. I think what was confusing for me initially, Ruthie, was that you started the question with, and what about people we despise, right? Which is, very similar to, or people that we want to destroy, as you said, Robyn. And so I would just add one word, which is forgiveness. And I think the important thing about forgiveness is it's not something we just extend to other people. It's an active, difficult process, but it's something that we also have to figure out how to give to ourselves. The word trauma has come up many, many times tonight, and I don't think you can talk about politics without trauma, right? And sometimes the trauma is so big, it knocks people out of this orbit, it knocks them out of this world, it knocks us out of this world. So, the active process of trying to figure out how do we forgive ourselves, how do we forgive other people in this work, I think is in a productive tension with comradeship. Comradeship is maybe a kind of ideal, but the love part is how do we deal with the messiness of, this world, our choices, this history. And I just appreciate this discussion, because I think if they're not held in some tension, if one is presumed without the other, neither does the work we needed to do. So, I leave this conversation thinking anew about, this term that I thought was important, that I think I have a different sense of now. So.
Well, comrades, I think we've come to time. I'd like to thank you, Robyn, Spencer-Antoine. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruthie.
My pleasure. I've looked forward to this day for a long time.
All right, Christina, get sucked in. You have to